Well, I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. I was actually one of the members of the audience for the other presenters this year. And I really enjoyed what you've all brought together this year to talk about issues of loneliness, which really couldn't be more pertinent in this day and age. You know, the issues around loneliness have been around for a long time, but they feel particularly salient these days. And one of the reasons that salience, I would argue, is this. So perhaps you may or may not have heard of Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, which is now a New York Times bestseller list, and have talked about issues of well-being and children, adolescents using social and mobile media. However, I have to admit I was a little bummed out because I was like, oh man, now I'm just going to be brought in to respond to someone else's work rather than talk to my own work, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to give you a more nuanced and complete understanding of the way that we can think about how social and mobile media fit into the well-being of individuals, both adults and adolescents, how we can think about these issues in a more complex and rigorous way than perhaps thinking of them as simply being a causal force which is ruining an entire generation. The first thing that I want to start out in sort of positioning my work in relation to this is that this is not new. I put up Jean Twengie's Atlantic article here, Is Facebook Making Us Lonely?, which appeared over 12 years ago now. And I want to remind you of all this because when I was a researcher back in 2012 and read that article and doing work on social media and texting in that time, I found her arguments to be ones which are incredibly attractive. The idea is that we are absolutely having a singular, universal response to social and mobile media, and it is creating harms that are knowable and measurable. However, as some of the critiques of Haidt's book and Twengie's research have pointed out, to make really big claims like that, you need really big evidence, and that evidence simply is not there. So if you're interested in knowing more specifically about this debate, I would recommend Candace Auger's new piece that has just come out in Nature Communications, outstanding rebuttal to these things. But I don't want to spend all of my precious time in a place where I've actually been really excited to be here just talking about someone else's work. Instead, I want to talk about all the exciting things that I've learned over the last decade of studying social media. To begin, I think we need to really think a little bit about history here. When we look at the research that is summarizing all of the things that we know about social media use, we have to understand that an incredible proportion of all of that work was done on Facebook. And by the way, I borrowed the 2014 logo of Facebook to remind you of this, that this is not Facebook as we know it today. This is Facebook that has existed for the last 12 years. In 3 different meta-analyses summarizing this work all the way up until roughly 2020, right before the pandemic, we look at all of those meta-analyses and we find that the association between all of the ways that you might measure specifically Facebook use and loneliness, there's no association. There is a non-significant zero association with that. If you look specifically at time, there's a small association, meaning the larger the people are more time people are spending on Facebook, the more likely they're lonely. However, this obscures something which is really interesting about these same meta-analyses. Social media use is also associated with extroversion and online social capital. So wait a second here. At one hand, we have it creating loneliness, but on the other hand, we have actually creating online community. We have it more social people are using it, but somehow social people are also feeling more lonely. All of these concepts come together in such a way that make it really difficult to parse what exactly is happening when we think about the association between social media use and loneliness. One way to think about this is a both and phenomena rather than an either or phenomena. What's very important about this is that Facebook can both be used as a social tool to cope with or mitigate loneliness, as well as it can be something that might contribute to loneliness, but maybe for different people, or maybe at different times, or different patterns of use that people might engage. One way of answering this question, which very, very few studies have done, is actually look at what happens when people are denied using social media. So they have to abstain from using social media experimentally. So if people stop using Facebook, it actually decreases connection. What's interesting is one of the meta-analyses that have summarized what happens when people abstain from using social media, we know actually people feel more lonely, less connected as a consequence of getting off of social media than they did before. In fact, one of my own studies, which was a pre-registered study, looking at these associations, found that basically you really have a hard time recruiting people to get off of social media because they are so intertwined with their network and want to stay on it. They're part of activist communities. They're seeing pictures of their grandkids. They're looking at ways of connecting with people from the past portions of their life. They don't want to lose that connectivity. For the people who are recruited to do these studies, they say, indeed, I lose some of my social connection as a consequence of that. So is this actually a story that says, hooray for social media, it's a fantastic way to build connection, it's ideal? Well, again, the association between these two things do not necessarily indicate that everybody is using them in a way that is actually going to promote digital thriving in the long run. The truth, I believe, is much more complex, and it requires us to think about Facebook theoretically and in the context of everyday life. So how do we go about doing that? Where do we start? The perspective that I start from is a needs-based perspective. Specifically, we can think of needs in two ways. On one hand, a need is something that is a requirement to survive. I need food in order to survive. And all of you have your pizza out there, so you're feeding the need right now, the need to eat, the hunger that it requires, that it's created. The second way is we can think of a need as an impetus, something that pushes us towards something. It is something that actually creates action through that need. So when researchers and theorists talk about this, they talk about need as being a requirement, we need it to survive, and a desire, right? When we think of these two processes together, it's called the two-process model. Specifically, the idea is the process of getting our needs met requires us to also have an impetus, a motivating system within ourselves that pushes us towards some sort of action that's necessary for survival. In the case of social behavior, we can think of it this way. When people feel lonely, right, they have a hunger for human connection. They desire it. They want it. In order to be connected, which is necessary for human survival, we have to have loneliness working within ourselves psychologically to push us to be connected with one another. I want to share you a study that I think is one of the most superb and interesting studies I've ever read on this topic, and it's done by colleagues here in Massachusetts at MIT. They did this amazing experiment where they had individuals who volunteered to either go an entire day in a lab with no social connection whatsoever, right, or no food whatsoever. So either they were going to have no food or they were going to have no social connection. And this included no texting, no social media. They actually even forbade people to listen to podcasts. They took anything that they could construe as social, and they said, no, you can't have it. In this process, what they did is that at the end of the day, they put people in an MRI machine, an fMRI specifically, and then they showed them pictures of either people or pictures of food. And I'm just showing you my favorite food, street tacos, preferably ones with some really excellent El Pastor or something in there. And if I saw that picture after a day without food, I would be so hungry. And indeed, this is what the researchers found. People who were deprived of social connection felt a stronger sense of desire as a consequence of seeing social interaction, photos of social interaction. People were hungry when they saw pictures of food, also showed a similar reaction. The fMRI results suggested they were in very similar areas of the brain. A lot of this suggests that this concept that when we develop sort of a deprivation of connection, we actually want something, and when presented with a stimulus that reminds us of that thing, we want to actually experience it for ourselves. We have a greater desire, and that is actually able to be seen in the brain. What's really fascinating about this study is that it begins to kind of open up all kinds of possibilities and thoughts about how we might think of social needs as a sort of a motivating factor. I also operate from kind of an assumption here when I think about digital thriving or human thriving, which is what my book next year on social biome will be about, is that I look at this concept of social habits and routines, kind of what do you do every day, how do you apportion your time, what kinds of ways do you spend your time, that may or may not be able to satisfy your needs specifically being here connection and autonomy and control. And this comes from self-determination theory. As a consequence of getting your needs satisfied, you have a greater sense of subjective well-being, greater life satisfaction, more positive emotions, less negative emotions. So, when we think about how this fits together, how do we know that whether or not this model particularly, what kind of habits or behaviors might people engage in order to get a greater sense of life satisfaction? Of course, because you've been sitting here all year, you wouldn't be surprised to know that social behaviors, 5 of these specifically, are actually associated with people's life satisfaction and positive affect. All 5 of these were identified using a machine learning model through the MIDAS study, which is Midlife in the United States, which took place over 2 decades and included over 4,000 participants. And what they did is they used this machine learning model to say, of all of the things we know about our 4,000 participants, which ones are the best predictors of whether or not people have a greater sense of life satisfaction, more positive emotions, less negative emotions? And 5 of them, 5 of the best, were social. positive relationships with other people, pro-social behavior, social integration, being social, which just means frequency in which that you interact, and then also your sense of self-esteem, specifically whether or not you believe that people have positive regard for you. When we think about these things together, though, then we can actually start to say, if the habits match the need, then people are more likely to experience a greater sense of life satisfaction over their lifetime. So specifically, the social pathways of having close relationships, which is something that I study all the time. Weak tie sociality, this includes talking to colleagues, meeting all the wonderful people that I've met at Harvard during the course of this year. It includes identity, esteem, and support, meaning I feel that the person I am is a valuable person to others. And also general approbation. If you think about approbation as being different than self-esteem, this is basically something that you might be praised for your accomplishments, right? You have something of value to offer a workplace or a team or something like that. So the idea is that you're kind of sort of a valuable person in some sort of broader community. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, when we come from a needs framework, is do social media ever operate in such a way which builds social habits that might get our need to belong met? And this is what the research says. I believe that fundamentally social media is most likely to actually satisfy our need to belong when it matters the most. And this is when it bridges divides. So one example of this might be individuals who live in a sexual minoritized community, right? People who feel like they can't get their social needs met in their kind of geographically proximal area. So they look online to find someone who can share their experience and they can understand one another's struggles. Group identity and affirmation for Black Americans, in this fantastic review article by Park, points out that online communities for people of color provide incredible opportunities for them to be able to find a community of support and esteem. Migrant families, families of incarcerated individuals. My co-author here and I looked at the idea of family communication practices that actually build a greater sense of family unity and connection. And these were done through media. Long-distance family, of course, and romantic relationships. And then something that's going to come up later throughout this presentation is, so people who are going through a socially isolated period of time. When people are really feeling disconnected, then they are more likely to benefit by the opportunities afforded to them through online and social media. When we take all 5 of these together, we can see each one of those avenues to getting your need to belong filled actually may be one part of each one of these. So for example, in a long-distance romantic relationship, that's a close relationship that you're maintaining. That's a sense of belongingness that's generated from that. When you're looking at issues of group identity or affirmation, that's an issue in where that your self-identity or your self-esteem is being affirmed. If we look at people who are going through a social isolated period of time, this might be a weak tie sociality, so they could be speaking to their online network. Imagine yourself leaving school and having to keep in touch primarily through text media or social media. So there's some weak tie elements here that are incorporated in this. So each one of these things that come from research traditions, which are very different from one another, have found that, yet again, there are ways through which that you can get your need to belong met through social media. Wait a second. Not so fast. Just because people can do this doesn't mean they do this, right? We can all live in sort of a utopian fantasy that the way that people use social media is always positive. In fact, people for over 30 years have always imagined that the online world is going to be filled with sort of a greater sense of positivity and connection than is in the in-person world. There are 2 ways to approach this question, and I think that are very important. First, one way of approaching this question is, what is the relative value of social media for loneliness and connection? Now, this is an important change or departure from meta-analyses to say that social media use in terms of time is associated with loneliness. This says, given all of the factors that might predict loneliness, how important is social media? The second way to approach this question is, to what degree does social media actually satisfy the need to belong on a daily level, right? So it's one thing to say that individuals who are part of online communities that have a robust sense of support gain something from that support. Sure, absolutely they do that. But does the average person, with their average use of social media, their average experience with what it's like to use social media, see the same benefits? So the first thing that we want to think about when we think about this is that's actually gathered from among the outstanding speakers that Vish has invited throughout this year. What are the primary risk factors of loneliness? I separate these into changeable and then less changeable reasons for loneliness. In the changeable reasons for loneliness, we can basically see that the quality of relationships, the quantity of social interactions, events, or relationships, and access to other people, unemployment, living alone, geographic distance, are more changeable risk factors of loneliness. Now, why do I call them changeable? Because as a communications scholar and someone who studies social relationships, I've got to believe we can improve our relationships. I've got to believe we can go out there and meet people, that we can actually take the time to reach out over distance in the case of having access to other people. We can make efforts to span distance through using media, but also, talking to people. The less changeable risk factors for loneliness include poor mental health, lower SES, genes. There's a genetic component to loneliness, something I think a lot of people don't know, that there's actually genetic reasons to believe that some people are more lonely than others. The death of a loved one or divorce, especially for men, as a major risk factor for loneliness. And then interestingly, a very common risk factor for loneliness is age. The age that you are predicts whether or not you're more or less lonely. Now you'll notice something. Did you see social media up there on this list? It's nowhere to be found at some level. So in some sense, why don't we know whether or not loneliness and social media uniquely predict? Well, the answer is, I'm kind of embarrassed to say because I'm part of a broader disciplinary inquiry into social media, is we didn't measure it. An astonishing number of studies on Facebook and social media use throughout the last 15 years did not look in a side-by-side comparison of whether or not these 8 things, and then you take a measure of social media, measured in a lot of different ways, whether social media uniquely would predict these things beyond what we know about the changeable and the unchangeable risk factors. Second, there's another major issue here. Social media is just one way you can communicate. My research, among others, have found that when you are communicating with people that you love and care about, guess what? You lose a lot of ways to communicate with them, right? You might contact them through text, you might talk to them on the phone, you might check in with them in all of these different ways, send them an email for more complicated things or for things that need a longer kind of place to have conversation. You do it face to face. What does that mean? A ton of social media research does not take into account whether the same people are communicating through social media and then 6 other channels of communication at the same time. My work and my book specifically sought to kind of unpack these issues because it was frustrating to try to say what is the unique complement or detriment of social media considering all these different factors. However, I did find one really good study that I thought actually might shed some light on this topic. This study done in 2019 was done with people by Cigna, the insurance company. It had surveyed over 20,000 individuals, and that produced this fantastic picture here. And it took all of the different risk factors, which would either have less lonely individuals or more lonely individuals, and it lined them all up based upon their effect size, and basically in order of how much effect that they have on predicting loneliness. What do we got here? Facebook and Twitter are both down here at the bottom. Very small risk factors proportionally to the whole, and in different directions. Now this is pretty revealing, because at some point you're like, wait a second, I thought social media was a singular thing, that we would know that this effect should be the same for both Facebook or for Twitter, from WhatsApp or TikTok. And I'm here to tell you, there's so little work that actually does these kind of platform by platform comparisons that we don't have a clear answer to this question. But I think what this does suggest is that social media is a small player in the bigger picture. In fact, I've done 3 other studies and published articles looking at the concept that social media, once accounted for side by side with other predictors of loneliness, don't play any role at all. Simply whether you are using social media or not does not play any role in whether or not you are getting your need to belong met on any given day. So this creates a puzzle, at least it does in my mind. It says, well, wait a second here. How is it possible that social media is used by really extroverted people to build social capital? It can be used by these different communities to find connection over space, but proportionally it means so little in people's overall sociality. The way that I have come to answer this question is the question of it's better than nothing, right? To me, this is a deeply empathetic and human approach to understanding the role that social media might play. So I created this picture, and I actually, after the fact, realized it looked like Pac-Man. And I kept it anyway because I thought that was still pretty funny, because I was like, yeah, I kind of like Pac-Man as being part of my slides here. If we think of all of the variance in loneliness, most of that variance is explained by something else, not social media. And Pac-Man's mouth is that tiny little sliver of variance that might be attributable to social media use. And guess what? I expect that nearly all of that comes from texting. almost all of the variance associated with social media use in terms of its benefit for loneliness arises from people who are more likely to use texting. Why do I say that? At least 3 different studies of 3 different age groups, for older adults, for middle-aged adults, and for young adults, has found that if you have social interactions through text messages in the course of your days, you feel more connected than you do than when you're alone. It kind of makes sense. As a person who has gone through an entire semester of being away from my loved ones and my family, I understand what kind of value can be to get a couple texts of encouragement. Ones that I got earlier today about this talk. Really nice, particularly. One way I like to think of this is social and mobile media have the possibility to build what I would like to call micro-affirmations, right? Little moments, little grace notes, little sort of places to say, hey, I'm thinking of you. Here's a cool meme that I saw. Here's a hilarious story that I just wanted to share, right? Jokes, inside jokes, little kind of tiny little bits of voice snippets that people love these days of sending voice notes to one another, right? So if you think about these little micro-affirmations, probably in the big picture, they don't make a lot of difference in whether or not we feel lonely or whether or not we have a great sense of well-being. But on any given day, on any given moment, they're a lot better than getting nothing. So another way to answer this question that I think is fascinating and probably underdeveloped is it's actually possible that there's a big difference between things that can mitigate loneliness versus things that can make you feel connected, right? One thing that's starting to develop is that theories and ideas around social connectedness are growing. What they're saying is just like affect, you can both experience loneliness and you can experience connection at similar times of your life. I think of your actually college years as being a great example of this. People in college express they feel very lonely, right? They moved away from their high school, their home of origin, they feel disconnected. But they also say, I have a lot of connection in their life. I'm meeting a lot of new people, I'm going to all these fun events, I'm experiencing all this sort of experience of being social. So what I'm trying to get at here is, one way of thinking about this is even if these sort of grace notes, these little micro-affirmations don't necessarily reduce loneliness in the big picture, they probably make people's days better, or they have the possibility of doing so. The next question that I think you should be asking yourselves as a smart, inquisitive audience who does not take simple explanations for granted is, but do we all benefit from the same? Do these little micro-affirmations, do these little text messages all give equal value to everybody? The best way I can share this is to share a story. Here are 2 pictures that I want to kind of help illustrate this story. And on your right is a athlete, a mountain climber named Beatrice Flamini. And Beatrice spent 500 days in a Spanish cave alone. 500 days. And this picture that you see is when she walked out of that cave and was monitored by media, and they're like, we got to see this moment where this athlete, this mountain climber, finally emerges from the cave and sees someone in front of her. You can see her smile, the embrace that she's about to receive. Another story that I want to tell you, though, is one that actually is a little closer to my home in Kansas. It's of Kenny Michelena. Kenny Michelena worked in the oil fields of Wyoming. Out there in that part of the country, you might see a lot of this. Oil derricks, empty fields, a lot of space. He worked intermittently in that kind of field for a while, and unfortunately he died by his own hand. And in that time, the main source of communication that he had was his sister through text. That's what he had to kind of create his social interactions beyond what he could get from his pet. These 2 people have something in common. They went through long periods of social isolation with texting as their primary way of communication. So although Beatrice Flamini was actually alone in that cave, she communicated with her team all day, and they brought her in food and they took out her waste so that she actually had human contact, but through text. The one question I think we have to ask ourselves here is that, is social media or texting helpful for people who are lonely rather than for everybody and their ability to get those micro-affirmations set? And frankly, this is where I think the real social dilemma is. So despite the really not very good, I think we can say it was bad when Vish invited me to speak about the social dilemma documentary from the Center of Humane Technology 2 years ago. I think the real social dilemma is this. Loneliness appears to be a moderator of the effectiveness of computer-mediated communication, right? Which is really puzzling. So, well-connected people can use social media to feel connected. There's several research studies that suggest that social people are good at replicating their online and offline life. They are also less influenced by using social media, meaning if they get any sort of hedonic pleasure from social media, it's less long-lasting, it doesn't make as big a difference on their day-to-day contact, and they also lose out more if they turn to social media because their in-life, in-person social network is so robust. So if they spend more time on social media, they lose out. Lonelier people, on the other hand, have less online social capital, benefit more from in-person social interaction time, and are more likely to experience negative outcomes when using social media. So rather than a solution to loneliness, right, which might be implied if we took the research on texting and what I was sharing with about social media as being evidence of how it has a mitigating effect on loneliness, I actually think it's possible that it doesn't benefit the people who need it the most. And here's a research study that I think helps to kind of contextualize this. I did a study with individuals, 150 individuals who completed daily diaries about their sense of connection and their sense of loneliness on any given day. I measured, amongst other things, their daily social media use and also their daily face-to-face communication. And then I also, before they engaged in these daily diaries, which lasted between 14 and 28 days, I asked them their overall level of loneliness in their own life, right? Trait level loneliness. So the blue line up here represents people who have very low loneliness. When people who have very low loneliness to start my study engaged in more social media use time throughout the day, they actually experienced a greater sense of connection. So these are well-connected people. But when people who were very lonely, right, used more social media time throughout the day, they felt less connected. Well, guess what? It's completely the opposite when you measure the amount of social time they spend with other people. People who are very lonely benefit the most. They have the steepest slope. If they're feeling lonely, chronic loneliness, they're experiencing that, when they spend time face-to-face with others, they feel better. And for people who are not lonely at all, they still benefit, absolutely. Social people like to be social, they enjoy it, they get something out of it, but they don't benefit as much. What this suggests, which I think is, and by the way, these results are also controlling for the others. So I controlled for social media use in this one, and then I controlled for the amount of time that they had face-to-face contact in the last one. The point that I'm trying to make here is that it could be the case that what we need to think about is how are people using social media, what sorts of ways are they employing it, and where do they start from? Which leads me to the final puzzle. The final puzzle, I think, here is how do we think about the way that social media might shape our social habits? I come from a perspective about thinking about kind of systems of social interaction, how we regulate our social contact throughout the day. I wrote a theory called the Communicate, Bond, Belong theory. And in that theory, I think about the idea of how we apportion our time throughout our days, specifically our social interaction time, and trying to get our needs to belong met. So the theory is very much focused on this needs framework that I was describing. It's very interested in social behaviors of all sorts of types. And in this paper, I argue that basically we have two competing forces. On one side, we have a force that says it's pushing us to get our belongingness needs met. On the other side, we have a force which means I don't want to put that much work into it. I want to conserve my energy. If I can find a simpler or easier way to engage in something, I will. This theory also suggests that we have a homeostatic social system, which essentially means that we might experience a sense of belonging that rises during the process of social interaction, but amount of social energy that we're using as we have social interaction wears us out. For anybody who sat through really, really long 3-hour classes in graduate school, you know what I'm talking about, right? The longer you're there, the more you're exhausted, right? Or anybody who's gone on a day-long interview, how much that social engagement requires of us, it's truly an exhausting thing. So the question that I think when these two things come together is, how do our social habits overall influence our regulatory systems? To explain that, I want to share a confession with all of you. I have been really lonely this year. It's been a tough year. It's been 9 months of spending time away from my family. And even though the people at Harvard have been extraordinary, welcoming, generous, interesting, excited, they're not my kids, you know? They're not my wife. They're not the same. And I've been really hungry for that social connection. The question then becomes is how long does a person have to endure the kind of loneliness that I've experienced before it changes my regulation of social interaction? One thing I can tell you is this is a very fascinating puzzle for a researcher perspective because it requires a really acute sense of how we might change something that has a homeostatic process. Fortunately, these are the same researchers, by the way, that contributed to the MIT study on connection. They suggest that you can think of it as a homeostatic system that responds to a set point. So up here in graph A, we have people who are actually going through high quality, high quantity social interactions typically. They're keeping it sort of regulated through that process. Alone time, more time connection. They're experiencing higher or lower quality social interactions throughout their days, but they all can do this through this sort of process of nourishing their relationships towards the need to belong. Something happens. Homeostasis is not maintained. Could be a person moving away for a job, like I just did. But moving away forever, never moving back to the place they were from. It could be graduating from school. It could be going through a divorce. It could be your kids moving out of their house, which is something I'm more alert to more than graduating these days. But the idea here is homeostasis is not maintained. You adopt to a new set point. I think what's really important to think about here is once a new set point is adopted, loneliness can actually become self-perpetuating. People become accustomed to being inward focused and, in fact, unsocial and alone. I will tell you that most of the lonely nights that I have spent here at Harvard, I have spent watching TV, kind of what everyone does when they're lonely. They turn to media. I've also spent more time on social media. I've texted more people. I have sought connection in the ways that I had available to me, but I have not been able to replicate the kind of in-person interaction that I have with my family at home. So the question then becomes is it possible that our habits can actually change what we become accustomed to? And this is where I use a theory that I've developed in my book, but also just generally I think is a possibility for us understanding how this works, which is that it's a social snacking perspective. Essentially, the difference between a quick hit versus a full meal. So people respond to symbols of sociality as if they are real. And the principle of energy conservation, the principle of energy conservation reduces our effort towards that need satisfaction, and social media are really energy conserving. So what happens is that social media might play a role in changing our habits around communication because they give you just enough social connection to not bother pursuing it in more energy-intensive, challenging, and face-threatening ways, like meeting new people. And being here in Harvard, I can tell you, meeting new people is very emotionally taxing. So a person might be, I'll just turn to my familiar places, the places where I know I can get that quick hit of connection. This leads to kind of a donut metaphor, right? If we think of social media as almost like a donut that Homer here is massively chomping on, the idea is that social media might actually start to engender behaviors, particularly with people who are feeling lonely, in order to try to cope for the feelings of loneliness, but develop a pattern of connection which prevent them from getting their loneliness needs resolved in the long run. Now, this is speculative, and when I promised you on the description of my own presentation that I would try to present a more complex picture, this is it. This is the complex picture that I'm offering. Do I know this to be the case for sure? I don't. But I do know some things that I want to share with you, so things that you can share with the people that you meet and talk to about, well, you went to that talk on social media. What did you learn? Here are 5. First, I think that there's pretty definitive evidence that social media do not cause loneliness, right? There are too many ways people can use social media. It has too many opportunities for social connection. It is too important to minoritized communities for it to be the cause of loneliness. Second, I do think that social media are not a particularly effective coping strategy for loneliness. If you are already experiencing chronic loneliness, you turn to social media to resolve it, probably is not terribly effective. Certainly not as effective as a face-to-face conversation or a new relationship would be. And it's especially not effective for those who are in the most of the need of human connection. But it may be better than nothing. Do we really want to take away social media from people who are feeling so lonely? People like Kenny Michaeletta, who had that lifeline to his sister, right? And a very few users can use social media in magical, community-centric ways that really fully utilize its way of connecting with one another. And when I think about this, we have to think about the concept that if we outright ban social media or stop them from ever being able to be used again, we're actually isolating people who might really need it. So what's the future? A couple thoughts, because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. First, my model for digital thriving is one that I articulate in my book, which basically says if we want to really think about how to best use social and mobile media in our lives, we want to tighten the circle, which means we want to be better connected with the people in our lives that matter the most. We want to strengthen the signal. We want to send high-quality communication in what we write. We also want to strengthen the signal in terms of how we go about choosing which modality to communicate through, trying to move more to a kind of a telephone or FaceTime kind of model rather than a text, which is better than social media. We want to improve the quality of the message, and we want to check in and we want to support and share. We want to make sure we're checking in on people who we love who are going through a tough time. We want to share our experiences. And one of the things that I loved about my research on migrant families and their ability to connect, they basically said, share everything, right? Every little day event, make sure that you're sharing with the people far away from you because you've got to keep that dialogue going. I believe that through these processes, we can satisfy our need to belong, which builds life satisfaction and positive affect in the long run. And that's my model of digital thriving. However, you'll notice there are some missing points. First, as we move farther and farther away from Facebook being the dominant platform by young people using it and more towards TikTok, will this change how we have these kind of calculations of the effectiveness of social media? It already has changed the degree to which that people use that time to share things about themselves. It's changed how much they send private messages to one another in terms of through that particular platform. Well, what about YouTube and LinkedIn and WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram? Has a lot of research been done on those to be able to better understand whether or not they affect well-being in the long run? No, not really. And as we actually found out, Twitter and Facebook are in the opposite direction when we actually think about whether or not it deals with loneliness. I've developed a model that I think might be valuable for anybody who wants to really dig deep into this. You can think about social media as 3 parts: social interaction time, content creation time, right? Like all the great stuff you get on TikTok and otherwise, and then things that are delivered by your network or people that you know or people that you're interested in keeping in touch with. So we have future questions. How do people create meaningful community online is still a huge puzzle that's been written about for 20 years, but no one really knows for sure how do people go about doing that. We also know for people who work the hardest in their online communities are also people who are very social in their everyday life, which means that's a lot of communication for them to keep up with. And if they carry the burden of keeping in touch with everybody, does it have kind of ends where it stops being beneficial to them because it's just too much communication? Other questions that we want to answer here is whether or not we can actually use social media to build connection, whether we can use it effectively as an intervention strategy to improve the quality of connection to each other. So I would say, I started this out with a response to some pretty famous people's arguments about social media, and I would say we need to first thing, shift away from the prohibition model. We are not going to get a whole lot farther along by basically prohibiting people from using their mobile devices or their social media platforms to communicate. It's not effective, it has counterintuitive effects, and not to mention having a 10-year-old and 13-year-old at home, they know how to work around that stuff. They know how to get around whatever prohibitions or bans that we actually try to put on them. The second, I love the idea that we need to embrace declining marginal utility. This is an economist concept that says the longer that you do something, the less you get out of it, right? So it's not the case that social media use tends to have as strong of an effect when you measure it as a do it or not do it as it does when you measure time, which means that most of the negative things that are associated with heavy-duty media use are associated with extreme amounts of social media or mobile media or television use. So it's just kind of declining. You only get benefits for a certain amount of use, and then it kind of goes away. But the final one that I really want to share with you is we need to help people where they are. We need to meet people at the realities that loneliness is a much more complicated problem, is a much more difficult nut to crack, and all the other 5 speakers that have come with you with fantastic solutions and thoughts and theories about how this work can offer interventions that I think we can all build on together. And we know it's going to take a lot of work to really deal with the issue as big as loneliness here and then also throughout the world. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. If you're interested in looking at the Relationships and Technology Lab, there's the website. And of course, I love talking to students, graduate students, researchers. So if you want to contact me by email, please do that.